Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into, kind of a heavy topic, It's this idea that's been floating around, this question about a possible second Trump presidency in 2024.
Yeah.
And why so many sources are calling it like a potentially disastrous choice for the U.S., historically bad, all that. We've got a whole stack of articles here.
Yay.
Some of them even looking ahead, kind of projecting forward to what a Trump administration starting, say, April 3rd, 2025 might actually look like.
Wow.
So our goal today, you guys are a smart bunch listening in, and we don't want to bog you down with too much detail, but we really want to get to the heart of it. Like, what are these core arguments? What are these potential consequences that these sources are laying out? So to kick things off, let's talk about American democracy itself. Like, what are the big threats that these sources are flagging?
I think the biggest concern, like the thing that runs through all of this material, is this idea of democratic erosion.
Yeah.
And it's not just about policy differences, right? It's about actions and rhetoric that suggest an actual risk to the very foundation of how American democracy works.
Right. And they keep coming back to, the refusal to concede the 2020 election, the whole January 6th thing back in 2021. It's like these aren't just isolated incidents.
Right.
They're part of a bigger, disregard for the norms, the rules,
Exactly. And it goes even further than that. Several articles talk about this idea of an authoritarian project, which is, well, pretty chilling when you think about it.
Yeah, and they point to some specific examples, right? Like the whole punish thing.
Yeah.
Using presidential power to go after political rivals.
Exactly. I mean, that's straight out of the authoritarian playbook. And then there are the constant attacks on the judiciary, dismissing any ruling that doesn't go their way as politically motivated. It's all about eroding trust in the system, in the checks and balances that are supposed to keep things fair.
And then there's this thing called Schedule F.
Oh, yeah.
Which, to be honest, sounds really bureaucratic and boring.
It does.
But the sources make it sound like it could have a huge impact. Can you break that down for us? Like, what is it and why are people so worried about it?
So Schedule F is basically a way to reshape the civil service, the people who actually run the government day to day.
Okay.
It could allow an administration to just get rid of thousands of career government employees. These are people who are supposed to be protected by merit-based rules.
Oh, wow.
And they could be replaced with, well, loyalists, basically. People who are chosen for their allegiance to the president, not for their knowledge or expertise.
So it's like instead of having like experienced professionals making sure things run smoothly, you'd have a bunch of yes men just carrying out orders no matter what.
Exactly. And that undermines the whole idea of a nonpartisan professional civil service. It's like, imagine if your car mechanic only knew how to change the tires, but kept insisting on doing that even if your engine was on fire.
That's a terrifying analogy.
Yeah, it's not a good situation. And when you combine that with all these other trends, the attacks on institutions, the disregard for norms, it paints a pretty bleak picture. It could weaken the safeguards that are meant to prevent any one person or branch of government from grabbing too much power.
Right. So it's not just about like one policy or another.
Yeah.
It's about the whole system, the very structure of American democracy.
Exactly.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about America's role in the world, because the sources also seem pretty worried about what might happen on that front.
Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety about global instability.
Yeah.
And the U.S. potentially becoming more isolated under another Trump presidency.
They keep mentioning NATO, like what would happen to NATO?
Right, because Trump has threatened to pull out of NATO before, and that casts a pretty big shadow, especially now with what's going on in Ukraine. Imagine if the U.S. just walked away from that alliance. It would be a huge gift to Russia, a complete reshuffling of the balance of power in Europe.
And it's not just the military alliances either. They're worried about climate change too, right? Like,
Yeah.
Would the U.S. step back from international efforts to deal with that?
Definitely. There's a real chance of another withdrawal from agreements like the Paris Accord.
Yeah.
And, the climate crisis it's urgent. We need global cooperation. And the U.S. pulling back would be a major setback. It's like we're all in a sinking boat and someone decides to just stop bailing water and start drilling holes instead.
Yeah, not a good look. And then there's the whole economic side of things internationally. The sources seem really worried about trade wars coming back.
Yeah, the whole trade war thing was, well, it's pretty messy the first time around. Those tariffs, especially on allies like China, Europe, Canada, it really shook things up. And the sources are worried about more of that. These blind tariffs, they call them. Like Tariffs without a clear strategy, just slapping them on everything. It could destabilize global markets, and ultimately, it's the American consumer who ends up paying the price.
Right, because those tariffs just get passed along to us in the form of higher prices.
Exactly. It's like they think they're hitting other countries, but they're also shooting themselves in the foot.
And it seems like this whole America first approach, well, it might actually end up leaving America pretty alone. One source even says, l'Amérique d'abord, l'Amérique seule, which is French for America first equals America alone.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark way of putting it. And it gets to the heart of the problem. By constantly going it alone, by treating allies like enemies, the U.S. risks losing its influence, its moral authority on the world stage. And that creates a vacuum that other, less savory actors can step into.
So internationally, the sources are painting a picture of, well, a lot of potential instability, a lot of risk. Let's bring it back home for a minute and talk about domestic issues.
Yeah.
I mean, beyond just the health of democracy itself.
Yeah.
What about things like, the economy, social issues? What are the sources saying about those?
Well, they're pretty worried about potential economic and social regression, like a real step backwards in terms of progress.
Give us some specifics. What kind of things are they worried about?
So one of the biggest things is this prediction about massive labor shortages.
Really?
Yeah, because of those radical anti-immigration policies we were talking about earlier, they point out that so many key parts of the U.S. economy, like agriculture, construction, hospitality, even tech, rely on immigrant labor.
Right.
And if that labor pool dries up, well, you're talking millions of unfilled jobs, rising costs, inflation going through the roof, American businesses struggling to compete.
Yeah, and it's not just about, having those people to do the work. They're also worried about the impact on wages and prices, right?
Exactly. I mean, if there are fewer workers, wages go up, which sounds good in theory, but it can also trigger a whole spiral of rising costs for businesses. Those costs get passed on to consumers, inflation takes off, and suddenly the economy is in trouble.
It's funny, one of the articles actually points out that Trump himself, he's reportedly employed immigrants at his own businesses.
It's a real paradox, right?
Yeah, it is. It's like, on the one hand, you have this hardline stance on immigration, and on the other hand, you're benefiting from immigrant labor.
Right. It really makes you question how much these policies are about actual economics versus, political posturing.
And there's the whole trade war thing again, which we talked
Yeah.
about earlier. The sources bring that up again in the context of the domestic economy.
Right, because those trade wars, those tariffs, they didn't just hurt other countries. They hurt American consumers, too, with higher prices.
Yeah.
And they hurt specific sectors, like they mentioned soybean farmers, whiskey producers, the auto industry. All those guys got hit with retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
And then there's tourism
Oh, yeah.
and education. I seem to think those sectors would be in real trouble, too, if immigration gets clamped down on.
Absolutely. Universities, tourist destinations, especially places like New York, Miami, Las Vegas, they rely heavily on international visitors and students.
Yeah.
And the sources predict billions in lost revenue if things get stricter. Think about all the jobs that would be lost in hotels, restaurants, all those industries that depend on tourism. And it's not just about fewer people coming in. They also mention those protectionist measures, like the tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Right.
Those hurt American businesses, too, the ones that rely on those imported materials. The Tax Foundation did a study that found that those tariffs could actually lead to thousands of jobs being lost.
Wow. So it's like these policies that are supposed to be about protecting American jobs, they might actually end up costing American jobs.
It's a classic case of unintended consequences.
Shifting gears again to social issues, what are they saying about things like healthcare, the environment, all that?
So there's this big worry about a rollback in those areas. They talk about the Affordable Care Act potentially being dismantled, a wave of deregulation on the environment and in the financial sector, and of course the possibility of a nationwide ban on abortion after Roe v. Wade was overturned. It's like all this progress that's been made over decades could be wiped out.
Yeah. And they also spend a lot of time talking about the potential for increased division within the U.S., even violence.
Yeah, this is one of the most disturbing parts of it all. They're worried that a second Trump term would just pour gasoline on the fire of polarization,
Yeah.
deeper divisions, more entrenched culture war, that kind of thing.
And it's not just about policy disagreements.
No.
It's about, a fundamental threat to democracy itself. Right?
Exactly. They point to things like the continued questioning of the 2020 election results, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. These are seen as direct consequences of that heightened polarization, of a willingness to break the rules, to reject the very idea of democratic norms.
And then there's this really scary part about the normalization of political violence and hate speech.
Yeah, it's like the more you hear this kind of rhetoric, the more it becomes acceptable, even expected.
Right.
And the sources see a direct link between Trump's language and the rise of extremist groups, white supremacists, all those folks. It's like they feel emboldened, empowered. And that's a recipe for a more dangerous, a more divided country.
So the big takeaway here is a potential future where America is, well, more fractured, more prone to violence, less unified.
Exactly. A more unstable America, both internally and on the world stage.
Now, let's talk about history for a second, because the sources seem to be framing this potential re-election as something really significant, historically speaking.
Yeah, they're not mincing words. Several of them flat out say that a second Trump presidency could be the worst electoral choice in American history.
Wow.
And they're not just talking about politics, right? They're talking about a decision that could have profound, lasting consequences for the nation's future.
One source even compares it to the Civil War in terms of potential impact.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really powerful image, and it shows just how seriously they take this. They're worried about a fundamental rupture, a tearing apart of the fabric of American society.
And they use some pretty strong language, too, like disastrous turning point, a rupture with the values of progress, unity, and responsibility.
It's like they're seeing a potential shift away from core American values towards something darker, something more divisive. One source even calls it a suicidal retreat, suggesting that this is a self-inflicted wound that could have lasting damage.
And they keep hammering home this idea that history will judge this decision, that future generations will look back and potentially be very critical.
It's a reminder that these choices we make, they don't just affect us now.
Right.
They have ripple effects that can last for generations.
Let's dive back into one specific area that the sources keep coming back to, the economic impact of those anti-immigration policies.
Right, because that's a big one. They're really worried about a dramatic loss of migrant labor and the consequences of that for the economy. They bring up that radical anti-immigration stance again, and the possibility of even stricter policies like mass deportations and fewer visas.
And as we discussed earlier, they make it very clear that huge chunks of the U.S. economy rely on immigrant workers.
Exactly. Agriculture, construction, services, hospitality, tech, I mean, the list goes on and on. They're saying that without those workers, these sectors would be in serious trouble.
So we're talking about potentially a lot of economic pain.
Yeah, they're predicting massive labor shortages, millions of unfilled jobs.
Wow.
Which would lead to higher costs, inflation, and an overall economic decline. And they specifically point out the vulnerability of small businesses, which often depend heavily on migrant labor.
And it's interesting, they keep bringing up that contradiction about Trump himself reportedly employing immigrants.
Right, it's that whole hypocrisy thing again. It just highlights how complex this issue really is, and how these policies might have very different outcomes than what their proponents are claiming.
They also connect this back to the tourism industry, arguing that stricter immigration controls could lead to a big drop in visitors.
Absolutely. They're worried about a less welcoming environment for tourists, more difficult visa processes, and a general sense that the U.S. is closed off to the world. And that translates into lost revenue, lost jobs, and a decline in the overall attractiveness of the U.S. as a destination.
So they're basically saying that this quest for, I don't know, for some kind of national purity, it could end up costing the U.S. a lot, economically speaking.
Exactly. They're highlighting that trade-off, the potential for economic decline as a direct consequence of severely restricting immigration.
Let's zoom in on the tourism thing a bit more. They really seem to think it would take a hit if these policies are put in place.
Yeah, they're predicting a significant decline in tourism. And it's not just because of stricter immigration controls. It's also about the message it sends, you know? If the U.S. seems hostile to foreigners, why would they want to come here?
They mentioned a lot of specific things that could make it harder for tourists to visit, like increased customs checks, more complicated visa applications.
Right, they're talking about more bureaucracy, longer waits, more scrutiny at the border. One source even uses the phrase Kafkaesque formalities, which paints a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, it does. And they're putting some big numbers on the potential losses. Billions of dollars in lost revenue for places like New York, Miami, Florida, California.
Yeah, they specifically mention New York, Miami, Las Vegas losing billions.
And they're talking about thousands of jobs being lost in the tourism industry.
Absolutely. Hotels, restaurants, all those businesses that rely on tourists would be hit hard.
So beyond just the direct impact on tourism, they're also raising broader questions about the image of the U.S., its attractiveness on the world stage.
Right, because if the U.S. is seen as unwelcoming, well, why would anyone want to study here, invest here, start businesses here? It goes beyond just tourism. It affects the whole idea of the U.S. as a place that's open to the world, a place where people want to be.
Yeah, and they point out that tourists will just go somewhere else if the U.S. isn't appealing anymore.
Exactly. There are plenty of other options out there.
All right, let's circle back to global instability. We touched on it earlier, but it's clearly a big concern for these sources.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme. They're really worried about a second Trump term leading to a more unstable, a more unpredictable world.
They bring up the weakening of alliances, especially NATO, which could embolden countries like Russia.
Right, because NATO is all about collective security. If the U.S. pulls back, it sends a message that those commitments aren't reliable. And that could encourage aggressive behavior from other countries.
And it's not just about military alliances, right? They also talk about the U.S. potentially continuing to treat its economic partners as adversaries.
Exactly. It's that America First mindset again, the idea that every deal has to be a win for the U.S., even at the expense of its allies. And that creates friction, undermines trust, and makes it harder to cooperate on global issues.
They also bring up the potential for the U.S. to continue undermining international agreements and institutions.
Yeah, they point to the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the criticism of the WTO, all those things. It's like the U.S. is signaling that it's not interested in playing by the rules, in working within the existing international framework.
Man, that creates uncertainty, right?
Absolutely, because if the U.S. isn't predictable, if it's constantly changing the rules, it makes it very difficult for other countries to plan, to cooperate.
Yeah.
And that leads to instability.
And then, of course, there's the possibility of more trade wars, more of those blind tariffs that we talked about earlier.
Right, because those tariffs, they hurt everyone. They hurt the countries they're aimed at, but they also hurt the U.S. economy. And they often lead to retaliation, which just escalates the conflict.
So the picture they're painting is of a world where the U.S. is less engaged, less predictable, less willing to cooperate.
Exactly. And that creates a lot of potential for conflict, for instability, for things to spiral out of control.
Let's talk specifically about climate change for a minute, because that seems to be a major red flag for these sources.
Oh, yeah. They're very worried about Trump's stance on climate change, his denial of the science, his downplaying of the crisis.
And they point out that he's called climate change a hoax before.
Right. And they see that as a real obstacle to meaningful action on climate change. If the U.S., one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, isn't willing to take the problem seriously, it makes it much harder to get global cooperation.
So they're essentially saying that a second Trump term could be a death knell for ambitious climate action.
Yeah, pretty much. They see it as a lost opportunity, a missed chance to address one of the biggest challenges facing humanity.
And they're also worried about the U.S. potentially withdrawing from international climate agreements, again, like the Paris Agreement.
Right, because that would send a terrible message to the rest of the world. It would be like saying, we don't care about this problem and we're not going to do anything about it.
All right, let's revisit protectionism one last time. It seems like they're pretty critical of those policies.
Yeah, they see those protectionist measures, those tariffs, as being very damaging, both economically and in terms of global relations. They bring up the trade wars again, the billions of dollars in added costs for American consumers.
And they keep coming back to that America First approach and how it ultimately leads to isolation.
Right, because it's all about putting the U.S. first, even if it means alienating allies, disrupting global trade, and undermining the very systems that have helped to create prosperity.
And they emphasize that it's often American businesses and consumers who end up paying the price for those policies.
Exactly. The tariffs might be aimed at other countries, but it's often American companies and individuals who end up footing the bill.
We talked about retaliatory tariffs, too, and how they can hurt American exporters.
Right, because other countries aren't just going to sit there and take it. They'll respond with their own tariffs, and that hurts American businesses trying to sell their goods overseas.
And despite the whole idea of reducing reliance on imports, they point out that it hasn't really worked that way.
Yeah, American businesses still need those imports, but now they're more expensive because of the tariffs. And as we discussed, those tariffs have actually contributed to job losses in some sectors.
So the overall message from these sources is that those protectionist policies are, well, pretty self-defeating.
Yeah, they call it self-destructive protectionism. It's like they're trying to protect American interests, but they're actually doing more harm than good.
So to wrap things up, let's do a quick review of those key domestic threats that the sources keep highlighting.
All right, so the big one is the threat to American democracy itself. They're worried about a disregard for democratic norms, the potential for a politicized civil service, all the things we discussed earlier.
And they're also concerned about social and economic regression.
Exactly. The potential for dismantling the Affordable Care Act, for more deregulation, for restricting abortion access. They see all of that as a step backwards.
And then there's the very real danger of increased political violence and hate speech.
Yeah, that's a huge concern. They're worried that this kind of rhetoric, this kind of behavior is becoming normalized and that it could lead to a more divided and more violent America.
And the overall picture they paint is of a country that's more polarized, less able to address its problems, less unified.
Exactly. A country that's moving in the wrong direction.
So to sum it all up, it seems like these sources are pretty much in agreement that a second Trump presidency would be a disaster.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. They see it as a multifaceted disaster with the potential for long-lasting negative consequences across the board.
And they keep using that phrase, the worst electoral choice in American history.
It's a strong statement, but it reflects the level of concern they have.
Well, thank you for joining me for this deep dive. It's been a pretty heavy conversation.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the threats to democracy and global stability to the risks of economic and social regression and the potential for increased division and violence. And it's important to remember that these are just the arguments and concerns presented in the sources we've examined. We're not saying this is definitively what will happen, but it's definitely something to think about.
Absolutely.
And as a final thought, I'd leave you with this. These sources really emphasize the historical significance of this moment. They're saying that future generations will judge us based on the choices we make now. So, as you consider all of this, think about what kind of legacy we want to leave behind. What kind of future do we want to create for ourselves and for the generations to come? That's something we all need to wrestle with. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.